On the 5th of January 1942, as exuberant cries of triumph echoed through the bustling streets of Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto directed the officers of the Imperial Combined Fleet to start gearing up for the next phase of military actions in the vast Pacific War. His careful review of the incoming reports from the Philippines, Malaya, and various southern regions suggested that Japanese soldiers would soon dominate East Asia and all the other territories they had struck back in December. Consequently, Yamamoto instructed his chief of staff, Matome Ugaki, that he expected the strategies to be fully developed by mid-February.
When war comes between Japan and the United States, I shall not be content merely to occupy Guam, the Philippines, Hawaii, and San Francisco. I look forward to dictating the peace to the United States in the White House at Washington.
The astonishing rapidity with which the Japanese had overrun the Western Pacific left the strategists in Tokyo in a state of awe, sparking intense debates within the Imperial General Staff. The fervent military patriots pushed to advance relentlessly as long as Japan held the upper hand, regardless of how distant such ambitions might stretch their resources. In contrast, another faction, embodied by Admiral Yamamoto, had approached the initiation of hostilities against the United States and Britain with considerable reluctance, harboring deep concerns about the long-term implications. One key factor behind Yamamoto's decision to remain at sea aboard the mighty Combined Fleet flagship Yamato was the advice from allies within the Imperial General Staff, who feared for his safety in Tokyo due to his vocal resistance to unchecked warfare. Even in this moment, his views were no mystery to those in his circle. His chief of staff, Admiral Ugaki, noted in his personal journal the imperative for visionary leadership in the wake of this initial month of splendid triumphs, phrases that Yamamoto frequently invoked to caution that Japan could not sustain a prolonged conflict against the Western allies and emerge victorious. Yamamoto's forthright critiques of the political figures targeted individuals like Prince Kono and others who appeared oblivious to the kind of campaign Japan ought to pursue in the Pacific 3 months prior to the assault. On Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had convened with an acquaintance, Ryoichi Sasakawa, the head of the extreme nationalist Kokusui-do group, at the prestigious Imperial Navy Club in Shiba. Alerting his companion that conflict was unavoidable owing to choices made by the politicians, Yamamoto remarked that initially they would dominate proceedings, extending like an octopus unfurling its limbs. And now, merely a month into the war, that octopus had nearly flattened out across the region. Yet Yamamoto had also advised his longtime associate that the initial elation would fade. He pinpointed the fall of Singapore as the pivotal instant for diplomatic maneuvers, reasoning that such a setback would destabilize the British hold on India, making them more amenable to negotiations for peace. Yamamoto possessed a profound understanding of the British, having participated in the delegations to the London Naval Conferences of 1930 and 1934. Similarly, his familiarity with the Americans stemmed from his tenure as Japanese naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. He concurred that once the politicians ignited the war, a decisive win had to be secured swiftly. However, upon attaining that success, he contended that Japan would enjoy merely a year and a half of unchallenged supremacy. "We must secure a peace accord by that juncture," he confided to Sasakawa, entrusting this old confidant to disseminate the message among the conservative political elites currently wielding power. On January 5th, victory appeared tantalizingly near. The American battleship Armada had been neutralized at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. The British capital ships Repulse and Prince of Wales had met their demise off the Malayan coastline. In the Philippines, Manila and the U.S. naval installation at Cavite had fallen into Japanese hands. The British had capitulated at Hong Kong, and Japanese units were advancing toward fresh incursions in the Dutch East Indies, at Rabaul on New Ireland, Ambon, and within the Solomon Islands. Nevertheless, The strike at Pearl Harbor fell short of Yamamoto's aspirations for obliterating the core components of the United States fleet. The aircraft carriers, which were out at sea during the raid, escaped unscathed and posed an ongoing menace. What was required was a monumental feat, and Yamamoto did not anticipate Singapore's capitulation for another 5 or 6 months. It actually occurred on February 15th. He surmised that to pave the way for talks, he needed to pivot toward an alternative path. But the pressing query for his planners was, where to deliver the subsequent blow? The Army dismissed Yamamoto's proposal for an offensive against the Soviet Union, as such a campaign would unfold predominantly on terra firma, and the Army was deeply entangled in China and Southeast Asia. Thus, 3 alternative concepts emerged. Yamamoto's preferred option involved an assault in the Indian Ocean, invading Ceylon, luring out the British Far Eastern Fleet, annihilating it akin to how Yamamoto had decimated the American vessels at Pearl Harbor, and then advancing into the Middle East to converge with the Germans advancing toward the Soviet oil reserves in the Caucasus. This would secure the Japanese Navy's oil supply indefinitely. The Army outright rejected any Middle Eastern venture, leaving only 2 viable schemes. One, endorsed by the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, advocated for an assault on Australia to strip the Americans of that forward outpost. Following incursions into the Solomon Islands, the Navy would seize New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Proponents of this strategy at Imperial General Headquarters were already devising administrative frameworks for occupying Australia and New Zealand. However, Yamamoto disfavored the Australian scheme, deeming it excessively protracted and lacking the dramatic impact needed to stymie the Americans. Yamamoto was acutely aware that the Pearl Harbor raid had ignited a vengeful fervor among a populace the Japanese had come to scorn as feeble and inept, too weak. The Army claimed to endure a war to its bitter conclusion. It became evident that even Singapore's capture would not deter the Americans. Yamamoto sought a triumph that would enable Japan to extend a magnanimous offer of truce. In January, Yamamoto commissioned the drafting of an additional strategy, and 2 months hence, he dispatched officers to Tokyo bearing the document labeled the MI Plan, which outlined a confrontation off Midway Island aimed at eradicating the American carrier contingent. He also forwarded the AL Plan, delineating the incursion into the North American mainland via Alaska. Should everything proceed favorably, Hawaii would be seized, and subsequently perhaps the West Coast at minimum. Triumphs at Midway and in the Aleutians would furnish the politicians with leverage to broker the type of armistice Yamamoto envisioned. In Tokyo, the admirals debated fiercely around the conference table in the Navy Ministry, but ultimately Yamamoto prevailed. Overlooked was the prospective import of Singapore's downfall in February and the imminent downfall of Bataan and Corregidor, either of which might have fulfilled Yamamoto's objectives. The rationale for their diminished relevance stemmed from the April incursion by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bomber squadron on Tokyo. The Doolittle raid jolted the Japanese into acknowledging that the Americans were merely commencing their resistance. In June, following the Midway endeavor's catastrophic failure for Japan, there was no opportunity for blame. Indeed, the Army remained ignorant of the debacle's full scope. The annihilation of 4 major fleet carriers was meticulously concealed, known solely at the Navy's uppermost echelons. While Yamamoto was engaged in his Midway venture, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo had progressively shifted the Navy and its aerial assets southward to prepare for the impending effort to isolate Australia. Naval contingents had seized Rabaul on January 23rd, and from that point forward, they executed ongoing aerial surveillance and bombing sorties against other islands and New Guinea. It was clear to the Australians, who relayed their apprehensions to General Douglas MacArthur upon his March arrival, that the Japanese would imminently advance on New Guinea. If triumphant, it would be a near-effortless conquest for the Japanese to claim northern Australia. In February, the Japanese had already bombarded Darwin, and in March, upon invading Salamaua in New Guinea, the tempo accelerated. In May, just prior to the Midway clash, the Japanese dispatched an occupation contingent toward Port Moresby, but it was repelled by the tenacious defense of Americans and Australians in the carrier engagement of the Coral Sea. The Japanese did secure Tulagi, north of Guadalcanal, and established a seaplane facility there. The Battle of the Coral Sea persuaded planners in Washington and Australia that they must brace for a Japanese thrust in the south. MacArthur advised the Australian administration that it needed to prepare for an assault preceding a Japanese offensive generally anticipated against India. He wired General Marshall requesting 2 carriers and 1,000 aircraft. But in Washington that May, Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, notified General Marshall that until June's end, he would possess only 2 operational carriers across the entire Pacific. Meanwhile, on Midway's eve, the Japanese boasted 10, and Pacific Fleet Commander Chester W. Nimitz had already issued forewarnings about the significant maneuver he anticipated from the Japanese, which materialized as the Midway Battle. As developments unfolded at Midway, the Japanese were solidifying their positions in the New Guinea Solomons sector. Major General Tomitaro Hori disembarked the South Seas Force at Salamaua, and naval troops occupied Lae, commencing the construction of an air base there. Independently of Admiral Yamamoto, the Imperial General Staff had orchestrated the Port Moresby operation, and Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake was directed to advance toward New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, and to be prepared to recommence the push against Port Moresby by July. That timeline would follow the Midway Battle, when Admiral Yamamoto was expected to return with his combined fleet. That substantial carrier force was anticipated to safeguard this fresh advance. Despite the setback at Midway, which was portrayed as a success to the field forces, Imperial General Headquarters did not revise its strategies. A few days post-Midway, the Australians apprised General MacArthur that the Japanese were poised to act. In light of the Midway victory, MacArthur proposed that the Allies launch a preemptive strike on the New Britain-New Ireland region, followed by an assault on Rabaul, the primary Japanese naval and air hub in the vicinity. With the 2 carriers, the 1,000 planes, and an amphibious division, MacArthur aimed to compel the Japanese retreat to Truk. On June 12th, General Marshall presented the MacArthur proposal to Admiral King, with certain alterations. He sought 3 carriers rather than 2, and 1 Marine division plus 3 Army divisions for the assaults. Admiral King resisted the notion because it would place MacArthur in command of the combat. King's additional rationales were secondary. The carriers would be vulnerable to land-based assaults, and they would lack adequate safeguards. As events transpired, the Navy grappled with both these tactical challenges at Guadalcanal. King formulated his own strategy, a thrust from the New Hebrides by forces under naval oversight. MacArthur objected to subordinating his Army units to the Navy, but no one could dispute the urgency of halting the Japanese before they seized New Guinea and threatened Australia. The dilemma for the Joint Chiefs of Staff was determining command authority for the operation. They assigned Phase 1, the principal task of capturing the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and nearby positions, to Admiral King. Guadalcanal was merely a dot on the map, devoid of recognized tactical or strategic significance. It didn't even warrant naming in this JCS blueprint. General MacArthur was granted a consolation. After Phase 1, he would assume control and eliminate the remaining Japanese in the Solomons, Rabaul, and New Guinea. Admiral King secured his preference because the Joint Chiefs acknowledged that King had already mapped a defensive perimeter across the Pacific to shield Australia, and his approach would demand comparatively fewer resources than MacArthur's. Thousands of troops were undergoing training in New Caledonia, and King had persuaded General Arnold to deploy several squadrons of United States Army Air Force planes there. He had bolstered Samoa and Efate in the New Hebrides and intended to establish a base in Tonga. Admiral Wilson Brown, whose hesitation during the Wake Island crisis had irked King, was reassigned to a newly formed entity called the Amphibious Training Command at San Diego. He and Marine Major General Holland Smith were tasked with devising innovative methods. For island combat, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, King's chief plans officer, proposed that the initial endeavor must focus on maintaining the line in the South Pacific while preparing the amphibious forces. The subsequent phase would entail a joint offensive by the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, through the Solomon Islands to the Bismarck Archipelago and the Admiralty Islands. The third phase would encompass capturing the Caroline and Marshall Islands, and the fourth would propel the Allies either to the Dutch East Indies or the Philippines. Admiral King endorsed this blueprint. It mirrored his own vision, and he arranged to summon Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, who was acting as a naval observer in London, to lead the South Pacific Command. King detached Rear Admiral Turner from the plan's division and instructed him to prepare for assuming command of the amphibious operation. All this was accomplished even before the Japanese assault on Port Moresby and Tulagi. Vice Admiral Gormley departed Washington on May 1st. He would assume command of the South Pacific Force on June 19th. But first, he needed to report to Pearl Harbor to confer with Admiral Nimitz, who would be his immediate superior. By the time Gormley arrived at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese offensive was already underway in the South Pacific. On May 22nd, an Army plane observed a Japanese photographic reconnaissance aircraft capturing images of Guadalcanal. Army intelligence inferred that the Japanese were preparing to construct an airfield there. On June 25th, Army intelligence noted that the grass on the island's central plain had been scorched, and tents had appeared in the area. A wharf was being built at Lunga. 6 days later, an Australian coast watcher on Guadalcanal reported that airfield construction was merely awaiting the arrival of Japanese construction units. He even identified the names, the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, analogous to American Seabee units. This intelligence was corroborated by a radio intercept from Nimitz's intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet's Radio Intelligence Group, which had deciphered portions of the Japanese naval code, intercepted a message indicating that the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces would reach their destination on July 4th, and Fleet Intelligence connected the dots. Admiral Turner chanced to be visiting Pearl Harbor that day en route to prepare for the amphibious landing somewhere in the South Pacific when Admiral Nimitz received the radio intelligence report. Admiral Turner realized precisely where he was headed. It could be nowhere but the Solomons. Within 2 weeks, Turner was in Wellington, where he boarded his flagship, the USS Macaulay, the former Graceline passenger ship Santa Barbara. His mission was to train an entire amphibious task force in 1 month. As Turner commenced maneuvering ships and personnel, Admiral Gormley was en route to Melbourne to consult with General MacArthur. Gormley departed New Zealand burdened with pessimistic reflections on the imprudence of attempting an amphibious operation when no one possessed the expertise. MacArthur, harboring his own grievances against the plan, concurred wholeheartedly. They also agreed that with the available aircraft, they could not ensure adequate air coverage for the landing. After all, this conference took place on July 18th, and the landings were slated for 3 weeks hence. They dispatched a message back to Washington suggesting postponement of the operation. But King was displeased with that communication. King had informed his new commander that he was assigning him a challenging task and that he couldn't supply the appropriate resources until perhaps the fall. The response was negative. The invasion would proceed as scheduled. Now, Gormley had left Washington convinced that the United States was unprepared for aggressive maneuvers in the South Pacific. His despondency deepened when he attempted and failed to secure Seabees and other units dispatched promptly to New Zealand. From the outset, the Guadalcanal invasion plan was marked by intelligence lapses. All involved commands were aware that an operation was imminent, especially after July 10th, when Admiral Nimitz issued Admiral Gormley his operational directives. The primary Japanese airbase was situated at Rabaul. Planes from those fields could halt at Guadalcanal, refuel, and then bomb Australia. Undoubtedly, they could inflict a severe strike on the Allied accumulation. But on July 10th, the Allied intelligence services report to King included only a passing remark about airfield construction at Guadalcanal, and a few days later, a report misplaced the field on the incorrect side of the island. By July's end, the Japanese had finished the airfield, and back at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Japan, Admiral Yamamoto issued orders that the initial staged mission would depart Rabaul on August 14th. As commander of the overarching United States operation, Admiral Gormley endeavored frantically to obtain additional assistance to construct advanced bases and import more planes, but wherever he sought, he discovered the veracity of Admiral King's assertion that he couldn't furnish Gormley with adequate tools. The supplies for the invasion forces, for instance, were loaded haphazardly aboard the transports at Oakland. There were ample docks to unload and reload the ships with supplies in the sequence of their planned utilization. Instead, the vessels were dispatched to Noumea, which lacked such amenities. Admiral King possessed at least a broad awareness of the obstacles, but time was of the essence for delay. King understood better than any subordinate the imperative of thwarting the Japanese before they reached Australia. The schedule persisted. By late July, the urgency intensified, and 17,000 Marines were en route by troopship from California, Pearl Harbor, Noumea, and Samoa. Admiral Gormley was too occupied to convene a meeting of his commanders, but on July 28th, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who was to hold tactical command, summoned a gathering aboard his flagship, the carrier Saratoga. For the first time, the tactical unit commanders assembled to discuss the invasion. Admiral Fletcher was tasked with shielding the invasion with his task force. Admiral Turner was to transport the troops of Marine General Alexander Vandegrift. Once the Marines secured the island, garrison troops would be introduced. But so precipitously was this operation convened that no provisions had been made for reserve troops. There were no additional men available in the South Pacific. The Saratoga meeting was far from harmonious. Fletcher commenced by declaring that he would safeguard the landings at Guadalcanal for only 2 days. He and Gormley's staff members at the meeting insisted that the carriers must not be jeopardized. Fletcher was cautious, convinced the entire operation was ill-conceived, rushed, and fated Admiral Turner, who grasped the global military landscape better than anyone else in the room that day, rebuked his superior. There was no value in such disputes, he asserted, and the determination had been rendered to hazard everything. It was their duty to execute orders. Fletcher should have recognized that. After Coral Sea, Admiral King had been so dissatisfied with Fletcher's persistent evasion of engagement that he had demanded Admiral Nimitz evaluate the state of Fletcher's combat resolve. Nimitz was a compassionate man and fond of Fletcher. He had delivered an encouraging address, and then, when the Battle of Midway was won with Fletcher in command, he could scarcely be criticized, but on the threshold of the first American offensive operation, to inform the troops and the support, ships' crews that he intended to abandon them in 48 hours was a most ominous commencement. The rehearsal for the Guadalcanal invasion occurred on July 28th and extended 3 days. The locale was Coro Island near Fiji. Only a third of the designated troops succeeded in reaching shore, and upon arrival they were uncertain of their actions. General Vandegrift deemed the simulation a total failure, but there was no time even for reassessment. On July 31st, the Marines were back aboard the transports bound for Guadalcanal. On the afternoon of August 6th, as the task force of 75 ships approached the Solomons, Admiral Fletcher anxiously detached with his carriers. He would provide aerial coverage over the landing force as pledged, but the 26 ships of the carrier group were being relocated as far from peril as feasible. If American intelligence was so deficient as to allow the Japanese to develop the airfield at Guadalcanal, Japanese intelligence was even more flawed, for as the United States invasion fleet assembled in the South Pacific, the Japanese had no suspicion of an impending assault. In July 1942, the Japanese Army was fixated on capturing New Guinea as a launch pad for operations against Australia and New Zealand. Major General Tomitaro Hori's South Seas force disembarked 2,000 troops near Buna. After securing Buna, the Japanese intended to build airfields there as a precursor to a renewed assault on Port Moresby. Thus, in July, Japanese air power was focused against Port Moresby. Bombers and fighters assaulted the piers and airfields nearly daily. Following the Japanese landings, the Japanese air forces were also summoned to bolster the beachhead, and in early August, their focus was riveted on the new thrust. The combined Australian and American Air Force countered with raids on the Japanese air bases at Leh. During these preparations, Admiral Yamamoto's flagship Yamato was moored at Hashirajima in Japanese waters. In a measured manner, he was readying for the upcoming air operations over Australia, and he would then determine the subsequent course. In preparation, on August 3rd, the naval air groups stationed at Leh were recalled to Rabaul to be primed for the Guadalcanal operations commencing the following week. During the first week of August, the South Pacific skies were overcast, and only a smattering of Japanese search planes ascended. None detected the American Armada steaming toward Guadalcanal. The Japanese airmen operating from Rabaul were astonished to encounter American carrier aircraft in the skies around Buna. They had been assured that the United States carriers were demolished at Midway. The pilots presumed the carriers were collaborating with Australian forces that had traversed the Owen Stanley Mountains. In reality, they were training for the Guadalcanal invasion. No one in the Imperial High Command or in the field suspected an impending invasion. After 8 months of unbroken victories, it was difficult for the Japanese to conceive that the Allies could mount a seaborne invasion. Had the concept been proposed, they would have concurred with General MacArthur and Admiral Gormley that such an invasion had virtually no prospect of success. So, as the American Expeditionary Force advanced toward Guadalcanal, it benefited from the element of surprise. On August 4th and 5, the 75 ships proceeded under cloudy skies, and on August 6th, the fleet navigated through rain squalls nearly all day. But as dawn broke on the morning of August 7th, the sky cleared, signifying that the carrier planes would enjoy excellent visibility for their strikes. The fleet went to general quarters at 5:30, and at 6, the carriers launched their initial strike. The planes from the Wasp, Saratoga, and Enterprise were assigned targets on Guadalcanal Island, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. The Japanese had established a seaplane base on Gavutu and Tanambogo, which were linked by a causeway. The Japanese planes had been grounded the previous day by inclement weather. Admiral Fletcher's task force reported one unidentified aircraft during the day, but whether it was Japanese or from General MacArthur's command remained undetermined. In any case, the Japanese were not alerted until 6:12 a.m., when the communications headquarters at the Tulagi seaplane base transmitted a frantic message announcing the attack. The radio message was directed to the 4th, 6th, and 8th Fleets, Admiral Yamamoto, and Imperial Headquarters. It was straightforward and direct. Enemy heavy bombardment in progress. The weather had cleared, and the carrier planes departed into scattered cumulus clouds under the glow of a quarter moon. The fighters and bombers proceeded on their designated missions. 8 fighters, led by Lieutenant L.H. Bauer, took off from the Enterprise to assault Guadalcanal's aircraft, PT boats, troop installations, and supply dumps. They discovered no aircraft and no PT boats, and they did strafe the buildings on the airfield at Lunga Point. Meanwhile, another 8 fighters from the Enterprise maintained a combat air patrol over the transports from 6 until 8 Oaks, when they were relieved by others. Bombers began striking Tulagi and the Lunga Point area, but no enemy air activity was observed all morning. The Americans had the skies to themselves, and the only planes damaged were those involved in operational mishaps. Planes from the other carriers targeted the seaplane base at Gavutu. The surprise was absolute. The American planes arrived and commenced bombing and strafing the seaplanes in the water. They destroyed 9 float planes similar to the Zero, 1 4-engine Kawanishi flying boat, and 8 seaplanes that served as search planes and bombers. A few Japanese pilots who attempted takeoff were shot down before becoming airborne. Not a single Japanese plane at Gavutu survived the assault. Other carrier planes hit Japanese troop concentrations on Tulagi. Some struck targets on the beaches that the Marines would soon invade. Before dawn, the Marines on the decks of the transports could discern the lofty mountains of the island that was their objective. The transports glided through the narrow passage between Guadalcanal and Savo Islands into Sealark Channel. As dawn rose, the guns of the escorting warships fired, and flashes of light illuminated the fleet. There was virtually no responding fire. The bombardment from the cruisers and destroyers accompanying the troopships ignited fires along the shore. An oil dump exploded, sending flames soaring into the sky. 8 Ang. After 2 hours of bombing and shelling of the island, the landing craft began moving toward the north shore east of Lunga Point. The Marines were anxious. Neither they nor their officers had any practical experience in such a landing, for this was the first American amphibious invasion since the Spanish-American War. At 9 Hikuru, troops were landing on Guadalcanal. They met no resistance because the Japanese had retreated into the hills. The progress was remarkably straightforward. The Marines soon realized how thoroughly they had caught the enemy off guard. They encountered wooden barracks that had never been occupied. They found a tent with a breakfast table laden with platters and bowls of meat, rice, and cooked plums. There were half-filled rice bowls scattered around, chopsticks hastily abandoned on the table or on the straw mats of the floor. The tents themselves revealed why the Japanese had departed so hastily. They were riddled with shrapnel, and some were flattened by the shelling from the naval vessels before the landing. But any Marine inclined to rejoice over the simplicity with which they had seized their initial objectives faced some revelations. It was accurate that the Japanese had been surprised on Guadalcanal, and they had not yet entrenched or erected permanent fortifications because most of the men were construction troops, not combatants. But over on Tulagi, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion and the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines had encountered robust resistance. About 250 Japanese were positioned on this island. The Japanese were troops of the Yokohama Air Base Detachment under Captain Shigetaka Miyazaki. They were seasoned and devoted fighters. Edson's 1st Raiders were the most formidable American troops in the Pacific. They were all volunteers selected from the ranks of a force renowned for its combat prowess. The Raider concept originated from Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's suggestion for forming a commando force, and Carlson's background included a several-month stint with the Chinese Communist 8th Route Army in its guerrilla campaigns against the Japanese in North China. Edson's Raiders had trained for many months under austere conditions, and upon arriving at Guadalcanal, they already possessed a formidable reputation. As it unfolded, they would require every tactic they had mastered and acquire some novel ones. This invasion marked the first encounter between highly trained American troops and battle-hardened Japanese veterans since the war commenced in December. The Japanese had cultivated a reputation even more intimidating than that of the Raider battalions, earned through the astonishingly swift advance of their forces through the Philippines, Malaya, and the East Indies. For months, Tokyo had boasted of its conquests, and half the world had come to regard the Japanese as unbeatable, a notion the Imperial High Command was delighted to foster. Tulagi, then, was in a way the initial proving ground. Edson's troops landed at 8:15 a.m. on the northwestern part of the island, and initially the progress did not seem much more arduous than on Guadalcanal. They faced some opposition from a few outposts. The northwest part of Tulagi was blanketed with dense jungle, small trees, vines, and bougainvillea with its vibrant leaves and sharp thorns. At first, the terrain appeared to be the greatest hindrance. Edson lost only one man, and that to a sniper, as the Marines hit the beach. Edson intended to advance inland to a ridge that spanned the island's length and then proceed along the top of that ridge, clearing the slopes as they headed south. But the terrain was so challenging that it took 3 hours for the men to hack their way along a 1.5 miles of ascending ground. Having attained the ridgeline, the Marines pressed forward, emerged from the jungle, and collided directly with the central Japanese defenses, constructed on the hillside. The Japanese had built dugouts in rock, embrasures, and had positioned their machine guns meticulously to establish interlocking fields of fire. The Japanese defense hinged on keeping the enemy beneath them, but the Marines discovered that by scaling the cliffs, they could drop dynamite charges and grenades into the dugouts, and that became the method they employed to progress. Once a dugout was demolished, it still wasn't secure. In one hole, the Americans eliminated 17 Japanese with dynamite charges. One Marine noticed a radio inside and entered to retrieve it. There were still 2 Japanese soldiers alive. and they shot him and another man who followed before. They were slain. One section of Marines tackled this defensive position in the island's center, while the center and left flank of Edson's force advanced down the ridge. But even along the ridgeline, the advance was not straightforward. One company incurred 15% casualties that first afternoon. The frontal resistance was rigid, but with the Japanese, frontal resistance was only half the struggle. Snipers seemed omnipresent, tied in trees, in the tops of buildings, behind rocks. A favored tactic of the snipers was to allow the forward element of a Marine unit to pass and then commence shooting at the men from the rear. This maneuver almost always signified death for the sniper, but typically not before he had inflicted several casualties. And one lesson the first raiders learned that day was that the small .25 caliber Japanese rifle and machine gun slugs were more likely to wound than to kill, which from the Japanese perspective was acceptable since it required additional troops and resources to tend to the wounded. During the afternoon, the raiders drove along the ridge until they encountered a three-sided ravine whose floor was an old British cricket field. The Japanese had dug into the ravine walls and established the fields of fire that would become so familiar in subsequent months. As the Marines approached, they ran into crossfire, and Edson halted because darkness was approaching, and this was no time to probe unknown perils. That night, the Marines on Tulagi experienced another novel encounter. The Japanese, aware they were outnumbered with no chance of survival, launched one of the desperate counterattacks for which they would become notorious. They waited until the Marine perimeter was silent. Then at 10:30 p.m., they breached between two companies and encircled one of them. The Marines battled in their foxholes and in the open, utilizing guns, machine guns, grenades, and knives. The Japanese advanced along the ridge toward Colonel Edson's command post and reached a point 50 yards from him. Finally, the Marines subdued the Japanese and repelled them, but not before one company had lost half its non-commissioned officers. The next day, August 8th, more troops were landed on Tulagi until there were 7,500 on that side of Sealark Channel. Edson's raiders and men of the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines resumed advancing toward the southeastern end of the island. One by one, they assaulted the dug-in machine gun positions on the steep sides of the old cricket ground. From one cave, they extracted 35 dead Japanese, some already decomposing and malodorous, but some slain in the final moments of defending the position. From this, the Americans correctly inferred that the Japanese tactic was to hold a position until the last, unless ordered to withdraw, evidence of the discipline of the Japanese armed forces. Those troops who surrendered on Guadalcanal were predominantly members of labor battalions, not combat troops. The raiders that second day encountered numerous examples of a spirit they had not witnessed before. In one dugout, they cornered 3 Japanese officers who, at the end, had only one loaded pistol among them. As the Marines prepared for the final assault, they heard 3 shots. When they entered the dugout, they found 3 bodies and an empty pistol. One officer had fired all but his last 3 rounds, then shot his 2 companions and himself. In those initial days, this suicidal mindset astonished the Marines. It was difficult for an American to comprehend how cornered or wounded men, with no hope of survival in their hole, knowing the enemy held material and numerical superiority, would almost invariably opt for death over surrender. It required adjustment, but after a few Japanese feigned surrender only to draw guns or bayonets to attack their captors or detonate grenades to kill themselves and their foes, the Marines accepted the Japanese on their terms. Thereafter, there was virtually no further effort to convince Japanese soldiers to surrender. Tulagi was secured on that second day, although not all the Japanese on the island had been eliminated. For days afterward, Japanese snipers harassed the American troops until the last sniper was dispatched. One gains an appreciation for the tenacity of the fighting on Tulagi through the experience of Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss. He had advanced ahead of his men to assault a cave near the cricket field. The Japanese had fired intermittently from that position. He approached closely enough to hurl hand grenades into the cave, and the Marines had been trained to pull the ring pin of the egg-shaped grenade, throw, count slowly, and hear the explosion. Sergeant Goss pulled the pin, threw, and counted to 6. The grenade was lobbed back out of the cave, and he had to duck to avoid the blast of his own weapon. After another identical experience, he held the grenade for 3 seconds, then threw 4, 5, 6, and out it came again. Sergeant Goss called for a satchel charge, a bag filled with dynamite, usually used to demolish buildings. He thrust in the charge, primed it, and ran back a little. The Japanese thrust the charge out of the mouth of the cave. The dynamite exploded and drove a rock splinter into Goss's leg. The wound was not severe enough to sideline him, but it pained sufficiently to enrage him. He seized his submachine gun and charged into the cave, spraying fire. He killed 4 Japanese soldiers and counted 8 others who had perished earlier. If possible, the fighting on Gavutu and Tanambogo was more intense than on Tulagi. The landings there occurred mid-morning. Not many troops were committed because no one anticipated encountering many Japanese there. But since the seaplane base was on these islands, the Japanese had fortified them, and the Marines encountered difficulty. The Japanese were caught off guard and had not yet recovered from the bombardment and aerial attack that had destroyed their seaplanes, so the first troops ashore were met by rifle fire only. But when the second wave of Marines reached the beach, the Japanese had organized about 500 yards back, and the fire was fierce. The third wave came under fire before the landing craft reached shore, and the casualties were substantial. Gavutu and Tanambogo were both dominated by small hills not quite 150 feet high, but above sea level in landings. This height was sufficient. The Japanese had constructed their defenses along the slopes, and they were well equipped with machine guns, automatic rifles, and ammunition. As on Tulagi, each Japanese position had to be captured. They did not retreat, and the ferocity of the fighting on Tanambogo was almost inconceivable. In the early waves, the Marines had landed tanks. The Japanese surged toward the Tanambogo dock where the landings had been made. They jammed crowbars under the treads, threw grenades, and attempted to set the tanks afire with rags soaked in gasoline. One tank commander opened the hatch and used the tank's machine gun to kill 23 Japanese soldiers before one clambered up the side of the tank and stabbed him to death with a bayonet. Another Japanese then threw gasoline-soaked rags inside the tank, and it burned. By mid-afternoon on this first day, it was evident that the Marines could use reinforcements, and a unit that had landed earlier on Florida Island, where there were no Japanese, was summoned to assist. Tanambogo had been taken, but the Marines were unable to secure the causeway that linked the 2 small islands. The reinforcements were directed to Tanambogo, and at dusk they received 5 minutes of preparatory bombardment from naval vessels. Unluckily, one of the last shells struck a fuel dump near the beach and illuminated the shore as if it were noon. As the Marines approached, the Japanese had them clearly silhouetted against the sea. From the dugouts on the hills came a steady stream of machine gun and rifle fire. 2 boatloads of Marines reached the beach, but the coxswain of the third boat was killed at his tiller, and the boat veered around and headed back out to sea. The following boats did the same, believing there had been some change in orders, so the men of the 2 boats were stranded ashore, and their only protection was the concrete pier. The Japanese were firing. As soon as the Americans returned fire, the Japanese spotted the position by the tracers. Soon, several men were down. One boat retired, taking the wounded, and it was some time before the confusion was resolved and other boats began to land. Meanwhile, the Japanese launched a counterattack on the beach. Captain Crane, the leader of the unit, was cut off from his boat, and he and 5 men hid in the brush. In the darkness, they escaped to return to the beach after the Japanese had withdrawn to their hillside positions. Eventually, they were extracted, but it was fortuit on the morning of August 8th before another unit landed and secured the causeway. When the fighting started, there were 500 Japanese on the connected islets of Gavutu and Tanambogo. When the fighting ended, there were none. Early on the morning of August 7th, the Tulagi radio station flashed the first word of the United States assault to Rabaul. The astounding news reached the Rabaul airfield. Just as the pilots of the early morning, missions were preparing to take off for another day's harassment of the Australians on New Guinea. The orders were immediately cancelled, and all available planes were dispatched to strike the American invasion force. Before the planes could take off, they received the unwelcome news from Tulagi. The entire flying boat flotilla had been destroyed. Then, contact with Tulagi was lost, which could only mean that the base there had been overrun. At 8:30 a.m., a flight of 27 twin-engine Betty bombers took off from Rabaul. They had been loaded for the strike against Australian forces on New Guinea, so they carried bombs instead of torpedoes. 18 Zeros accompanied them as they climbed to 13,000 feet, flew east to Bougainville Island, and turned south along the Bougainville coast. They were detected by 4 Enterprise planes just after 1 p.m. in the afternoon. The Enterprise fighters were flying at 18,000 feet when, down below, they spotted the large formation of Betty bombers escorted by the Zeros just above Florida Island. The F-4Fs attacked, and Lieutenant VP Dace shot down 1 bomber. 4 others began to smoke and were listed as probables. But after this initial run, the Zeros joined the fight, and the F-4Fs broke off to take refuge in cloud cover, as they had been instructed to do. They had been hard hit. One of the F-4Fs had been shot down, and Lieutenant Dace's plane was so badly damaged he had to make an emergency landing on the Wasp. Lieutenant G.E. Firebaugh led another flight of 6 fighters from the Enterprise, and they found the enemy off Santa Isabel Island. The Zeros came in fast, 10 of them, and attacked 3 of the fighters. All 3 F-4Fs were shot down. The other 3 American fighters attacked the bombers, and Ensign R.N. Disco shot down 1 Betty. The first kill of a Zero was made by radioman T.W. Rhodes, but the Zeros came after them in force and the F-4Fs ducked into clouds to hide. There were 10 Zeros after them in 2 formations, and they came in observing the Japanese rule. Never let your wingman out of sight. They attacked the F-4Fs from the starboard quarter, and Lieutenant Firebaugh and enlisted pilot W.S. Stevenson, Jr., and pilot machinist W.H. Warden were shot down. One of the coast watchers picked up Firebaugh from the water off Santa Isabel Island. A Guadalcanal coast watcher sent a canoe to rescue Warden off that same island, but Stevenson was not found. Aboard the other carriers, the story was much the same. The bombers were much easier targets. 6 fighters of Flight 323 ran into enemy bombers off Lunga Point and shot down 4 of them. Machinist D. Runyon destroyed 2 single-handedly. Just after 2:30 p.m., when the Japanese Betty bombers and Zero fighters began their run over the islands, coast watchers were on alert. Paul Edward Mason, a copra planter in peacetime, was stationed on Malaita Hill on Bougainville overlooking Bouin. At 9:00 in the morning, he sent a message that 24 Japanese bombers were heading toward Guadalcanal. They were still 400 miles or 2¼ hours away from the target when that message was broadcast back from Pearl Harbor to the fleet. That message reached the invasion fleet in plenty of time for preparations. The reaction of HMAS Canberra, one of the Australian cruisers, was typical. When the word came, the boatswain's mate piped the message. The ship will be attacked at noon by 24 torpedo bombers. All hands will pipe to dinner at 11 NEU, and the torpedo bombers arrived right on schedule. The United States fighters climbed above them to 20,000 feet as the bombers reached the north shore of Guadalcanal and looked down on the invasion fleet at noon. The American carrier fighters and the guns of the ships were ready for them. For the first time in the South Pacific, the Japanese were experiencing the effects of counterattack. The American fighter planes were quite effective against the twin-engine bombers. Of the 24 Bettys that finally arrived over Guadalcanal, all but 1 was shot down, and the only damage sustained in that first attack was to the destroyer Mugford, which was hit by a bomb. Against the Zero fighters, however, it was a different story. Pilot Officer Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading ace, was among those 18 chosen for their skill to make this first long-range mission over the target. The Japanese force was jumped by F-4F Wildcats from the carriers, and they went in straight for the bombers, or ignoring the Zeros. The Zeros protected the bombers as well as they could, but then turned to the American fighters. Sakai was puzzled by the American tactics. The Navy pilots dived against the Zeros, but if they missed on the first pass, they scattered and evaded. They had been instructed well by their intelligence officers, who knew that the Zero was superior in turning and climbing ability as well as faster. After a grim and skillful battle, Sakai shot down one F-4F and an SBD dive bomber that by itself jumped 4 Zeros. Several other Japanese pilots made kills, while 1 Zero was lost. Pilot Sakai attacked a group of the SBD torpedo bombers, thinking they were fighters, and ran straight into 4 spitting machine guns manned by rear gunners who had him dead as he came in. His Zero was badly smashed and he was seriously wounded, yet he managed to fly the plane back to Rabaul and land it before collapsing. In the air, the Japanese still held a temporary advantage in the quality of the Zero, but already the Americans in their F-4Fs were beginning to learn to use the limitations of the enemy to their advantage. The matter of control of the air was obviously going to be hotly contested. At this particular moment, the Americans had the advantage of proximity, with the carriers close offshore, but the Japanese had the advantage of numbers at Rabaul, and the American effort was seriously hampered by the superiority of the Japanese Zeros over the American fighters. The carrier pilots were flying the F-4F Wildcat, which was not as fast or as maneuverable as the Zero, and the Japanese could fly rings around them. The one advantage of the F-4F was its sturdy construction and armor protection. All that was needed to keep the ratio of lost planes as low as it was for the Americans at Rabaul. The Japanese recovered rapidly from the surprise of the American invasion, but the problem for the Japanese fighters was the 100-mile round trip. For that reason, on the first day, Commander Nakajima, the leader of the fighter squadron, had resisted demands by higher authority that all Zeros available be sent into the fight and had dispatched only his most experienced flyers. He was soon to be sending others, and the losses grew more serious, largely because of the vast distances to be traversed. By nightfall of the first day, the United States invasion seemed secure. The American troops had moved up near the airfield and had not encountered any substantial resistance. One prisoner was captured, and he indicated that there were only about 600 combat troops on the island and 400 laborers, and that they had fled to the opposite side. Admiral Turner had moved 11,000 Marines ashore, and vast piles of ammunition, food, and other supplies crowded the beaches. General Vandegrift had noticed that the beach force was unable to assimilate the supplies, but fearing that the carriers would soon move out, he was glad to see the supplies still coming in. He did establish a second beachhead, but it was soon crowded as badly as the first. At 8:40 a.m. on the morning of August 8th, Coast Watcher Jack Reed at Bua Passage spotted 45 Japanese dive bombers that had taken off from Kavieng 30 minutes later. Pearl Harbor repeated the broadcast to the ships. The carrier planes attacked and destroyed many of the enemy bombers, but on this day, the United States ships did not escape unscathed. A blazing bomber dived into the deck of the transport George F. Elliott and set it afire. One dive bomber sent a torpedo into the destroyer Jarvis, putting it out of action. That morning, the planes of the Enterprise and the other carriers took off on their missions and found the skies clear. They strafed and bombed troop concentrations along the Tanaru River, and they worked over the airfield again. At about 10 Hanlan, 3 fighters from the Enterprise discovered a group of Japanese torpedo bombers coming in low over the surface of the water to attack the transports. The Americans jumped them. Machinist Runyon shot down 1 bomber and 1 fighter. Ensign V.H. Ritchie shot down 2 twin-engine torpedo bombers, and Ensign J.D. Shoemaker shot down another. That was the end of the air activity for the day. At nightfall, the Enterprise's Fighting 6 counted its losses. 6 pilots shot down by Zeros. The Japanese Zero fighters still had the edge in experience in aircraft, but the American pilots were already beginning to learn tricks of the trade. The commander of the Enterprise Air Group concluded that the Zero had 2 major weaknesses: limited firepower and inability to withstand punishment. Because of the Zero's superior rate of climb, maneuverability, and fuel capacity, the F-4F pilots were warned to stick close together, and when attacked, each 2-plane element should set up a scissors movement, constantly turning toward each other. Thus, the pair of F-4Fs could concentrate their superior firepower on the enemy while they knew their own planes could absorb an enormous amount of punishment. On the ground, the Marines fought fierce Japanese opposition on Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. On Tulagi, they suffered 90 casualties but took control of the island by the end of the second day. The Japanese garrison of 250 men fought to the end. 200 men were killed, 3 surrendered, and the rest swam the strait to Florida Island to continue fighting. On Gavutu and Tanambogo, the Marines suffered 250 casualties. The 500-man Japanese garrison was wiped out to the last man. The fierceness of this fighting on Tulagi was in sharp contrast with the easy advance of the Marines on Guadalcanal. There, on the morning of August 8th, the Marines reached the edge of the airport they would name Henderson Field, after a flyer killed at Midway. They were beginning to develop a contempt for the enemy. "I wish those Japanese would come out and fight," one Marine said within the hearing of Richard Tregaskis, the International News Service correspondent who had accompanied the invasion. "All they do is run into the jungle." On the surface, then, the Marines couldn't ask for a finer war, but the officers were edgy that second afternoon. It was too easy. At sea, the Americans apparently had no opposition either. A few Japanese patrol craft and tenders and 1 or 2 transports had been caught off the shore, and they had been destroyed in the first hours of the invasion by shelling and bombing. Only in the air were the Japanese giving the Americans pause. Most of those first waves of bombers were destroyed, but the cost of meeting the Zeros was 21 of Admiral Fletcher's 99 carrier planes. That loss, not high by operational standards, convinced Fletcher that his decision to withdraw was sound. At 6 that evening, Fletcher asked Admiral Gormley to allow him to withdraw his carriers. He withdrew before he had a reply. When Admiral Turner intercepted Fletcher's dispatch, he realized that the carrier withdrawal would leave him without any air cover. The number of Japanese planes could be expected to increase sharply as the enemy brought down more aircraft through the island chain. As Fletcher began to withdraw, the Japanese were moving in force. When the word of invasion had been flashed from Guadalcanal to Rabaul, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa had reacted immediately. Admiral Mikawa was commander of the Japanese 8th Fleet and the Outer South Seas Force, which meant he had the responsibility for the whole South Pacific operation. His first move was to load 6 small transports with troops and dispatch them with destroyer, escort to reinforce the 2,000-man Guadalcanal garrison. But the convoy ran into the American submarine S-38, which was operating out of Australia following the fall of the Philippines. The S-38 sank the transport Mayo-Maru with 342 men aboard. The sinking, coupled with the reports of the enormous American invasion flotilla, persuaded the admiral that it was too dangerous at the moment to try to reinforce the garrison, and he called back the other 5 transports. By that time, Japanese naval assistance was already on the way to Guadalcanal. Admiral Mikawa had been lucky in the matter of timing. Early on the morning of August 7th, as the Tulagi garrison sent its last message, 5 heavy cruisers left Kavieng on the northern tip of New Ireland. 3 of them were headed northeast for Manus Island in the Admiralty Group, and 2 were bound for Rabaul. Admiral Mikawa soon ordered all 5 cruisers to hasten to Rabaul. Shortly after noon, the cruiser Chokai, accompanied by a destroyer, moved into Simpson Harbor. The other 4 cruisers waited in St. George's Channel between New Ireland and New Britain for the Chokai to rejoin. When she came up late that afternoon, she was carrying Admiral Mikawa himself and was accompanied by the light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari. So the Japanese moved toward Guadalcanal with 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer. As they sped south, Admiral Mikawa composed his battle plan. By reducing speed, they could delay their arrival until after midnight on August 8 and make a surprise night attack on the American forces at the beachhead. The admiral knew that the Americans had several carriers in that area while he had none. A night attack was a guarantee that he would not be harassed by American planes, since the Americans had no record of proficiency in night aerial operations. In fact, the Americans had no record of competence in any sort of night naval operations, while this aspect of tactics had become a Japanese specialty. Mikawa's problem that afternoon was how to move close to Guadalcanal without arriving too soon and still not forfeit the element of surprise. He had to attack to support the Guadalcanal defenders, but if he could surprise the enemy, the effectiveness would be enormous. The admiral did not know it just then, but the nature of the divided command, the inferiority of the American air intelligence system, and the lack of clearly defined search methods would all play directly into his hands. For intelligence about Japanese ship movements, the Americans at Guadalcanal had to depend on air search and submarine reports. Only under the most special circumstances would the reports of coast watchers be of much use concerning naval ship operations. Early in the day, the cruisers were sighted by United States B-17 Army bombers as they moved down toward Rabaul. On the evening of August 7th, the Mikawa force was sighted by the S-38 just as it came out of St. George's Channel that night. The commander of the S-38 reported the contact to Brisbane. But those two reports were not given much credence by American naval commanders because Rabaul had become the Japanese Navy's forward base, and it was quite normal for ships to move in and out. The Americans saw no indication that the ships in question were steaming toward Guadalcanal. Admiral Gormley was responsible for the coordination of all elements of the American attack, but to secure air searches, he had to depend on several sources. First were the long-range B-17 bombers of General MacArthur's American Army Air Force and the Australian Army Air Force, part of MacArthur's command, which operated independently. Second was Admiral McCain's land-based Naval Air Force, which included a number of seaplane tenders and PBY patrol bombers. General MacArthur's planes were to take responsibility for the search of the Bismarck Islands, concentrating on the big naval and air base at Rabaul. McCain was to watch the northern approaches to the region, which meant Truk and the Marshalls. Admiral Fletcher's carrier planes were supposed to make short-range searches but actually made none at all. Fletcher was preoccupied with his concerns. Admiral Turner had examined his charts and seen that the Japanese had a superb approach to the island of Guadalcanal along the west coast of Bougainville, straight down between Choiseul Island and Vella La Vella, past Colombangara between New Georgia and Santa Isabel, and then between Florida Island and Guadalcanal's north coast. The lane was christened the Slot. Soon it was to become infamous in American naval history. On the morning of August 8th, 4 PBYs were scheduled to fly from Nandi on a 700-mile-long triangular pattern whose apex was the Fiji Islands. They would come up almost due west of Santa Cruz Island. 6 PBYs would fly search patterns from Espiritu Santo northeast over the Santa Cruz Islands and end at a point slightly above the Bismarcks, but far to the west of the Japanese task force. 6 PBYs would spread out from Malaita across the slot from Guadalcanal to search an area north and west of the slot. 3 B-17s were to search north of Guadalcanal. On the night of August 7th, when Admiral Turner studied the search plan for the following day, he found the slot was completely uncovered. He asked Admiral McCain for a special search there the next day, but somehow, between Admiral Turner's flagship, Admiral McCain's headquarters, and the seaplane tender Mackinac at Malaita, the message was lost. The search was never made. Thus, on August 8th, the Americans had left uncovered the most obvious approach of any enemy naval force to Guadalcanal.